Dave Turin didn't go looking for a fortune that day. He just wanted to stabilize a collapsed drift before it swallowed the rest of the cut. But the moment his crew pulled that first shattered beam from the rubble, everything changed. Mapping errors, false tunnels, empty records. None of it prepared Dave for what was buried beneath a century of dust and silence. Because hidden under that collapse wasn't just a void, it was a doorway leading straight to a stash no miner, no geologist, and no historian ever knew existed. A stash so massive it shouldn't be real. A stash that would rewrite everything about the old-timers who worked these grounds. So if you're ready to see how one collapse exposed $105 million in secret gold, hit that like button, subscribe, and buckle in. Because what Dave Turin just uncovered defies every rule of mining. The day started like any other, until the ground beneath Dave's boots shuddered with a deep, sickening groan. A century-old support beam inside the abandoned cut snapped like a matchstick, echoing down the tunnel like a gunshot. His crew froze. Then came the roar. Dust exploding outward, rock shifting, the entire front of the drift collapsing in on itself. But when the dust finally cleared, what lay behind that wall wasn't destruction. It was revelation. The tunnel didn't end where the old maps claimed. It kept going, much farther. So far, the headlamps couldn't even catch the end of it. Dave scanned the void with his equipment, expecting the usual false readings. Instead, the sensors went wild, showing an underground space big enough to swallow their entire wash plant. That made no sense. No mining records, no historic maps, no old-timer stories ever mentioned a secondary chamber this massive. The collapse didn't just break open a tunnel. It had punched a hole straight into a hidden section of the mountain no one had seen in over 100 years. Dave stepped over the rubble, and that's when he saw it. A glint, a thin metallic line jutting out from a chunk of collapsed rock. Too straight, too perfect, too deliberate to be a natural formation. That single glint told Dave one thing. Someone had been here before, and whatever they left behind wasn't just abandoned equipment. The crew cleared more rock, working slow and careful, until they uncovered something even stranger. The broken timbers had carved markings, symbols, lines, shapes, cut with precision. Not the casual notches miners usually made. Something else, something coded. Beneath them, emerging from the rubble, was a small curve of old cart track, almost like a fingertip pointing downward into the earth. No one had any idea why it would angle that way, but Dave knew this wasn't random. Someone built a path leading deeper for a reason. As they hauled out the debris, layers of black sand spilled across the tunnel floor, instantly catching Dave's attention. Black sand wasn't unusual in gold country, but this concentration, this deep, this untouched, that was rare, too rare to ignore. Caleb knelt down, scooped a piece of quartz from the shattered rubble, held it to his flashlight, and it sparkled with visible gold wired through the stone like veins of fire. But the biggest shock came when Caleb tugged something soft out of the rubble. A leather pouch, toughened with age, stitched by hand, sealed with a brittle strap. Inside, century-old survey notes, pages yellowed and fragile, but the writing sharp enough to read. The final line punched Dave right in the gut. Lower chamber of pay, sealed for safety. A lower chamber, not recorded, not spoken of, not mined. A pay zone hidden intentionally beneath the mountain. And the notes weren't the only thing in the pouch. Pressed between two pages was a hand-drawn map. Rough, urgent lines sketched by a miner, desperate to remember. And right in the center, encircled in thick pencil strokes, was a massive oval zone labeled with one word, horde. Dave didn't waste time. He moved deeper, following the direction the map suggested, and almost immediately the atmosphere changed. The air blowing from the unexplored drift wasn't cold like ancient tunnels usually were. It was warm. Warm airflow meant open space, and open space meant something big was waiting ahead. Before reaching the drift entrance, Dave spotted a pickaxe wedged in the rock wall, frozen mid-swing. It had snapped in half during use, the handle splintered, the metal head buried in the stone, like the miner never had the chance to pull it free. That was no accident. That was a moment captured in time. A moment when something forced the miners to abandon their work instantaneously. Dave raised his scanner again. The drift behind the rockfall was still intact. Not collapsed, not flooded, just sealed. The old survey notes calling it for safety didn't sit right with him. Nothing about what they were uncovering was normal, safe, or accidental. But that sealed drift, the one earlier crews refused to enter, was exactly where the map pointed. He brushed dust off the hand-drawn lines again, tracing the route with his finger. Everything lined up. The track angled downward, the airflow direction, the warm pockets, the strange symbols carved into the timbers. Every clue pointed to that sealed drift. And according to that map, just beyond it, the massive oval zone, the one labeled Horde. Dave stared into the dark opening, aware they'd crossed the boundary between ordinary mining and something far older, far more orchestrated. This wasn't leftover equipment or forgotten tunnels. This was intentional concealment, designed, mapped, and hidden by someone who clearly didn't want it found. And as Dave lifted his headlamp toward the drift's entrance, the warm air pulsing from somewhere deep within, he realized they were standing on the threshold of the place those first miners feared most. As the crew pressed forward, the drift tightened around them, the earth seeming to breathe with each step, and that's when the truth sharpened into focus. The walls weren't the static remains of a forgotten mine. They were shifting, alive with movement that couldn't have happened decades ago. Fresh cracks cut through the rock, pale and sharp-edged, each one glimmering with thin, unnatural ribbons of gold that didn't match any known deposit in the region. It was as if the collapse above had torn open the earth just enough to expose veins that had been sealed since the last ice age. Dave brushed his hand along the gravel-packed wall and felt the unmistakable texture of ancient channel material, untouched, undisturbed, and impossible to reach without intent. Whatever lay ahead hadn't been stumbled upon by old-timers. It had been pursued, hidden, and now, for the first time in a century, exposed. Every step forward churned up more black sand beneath their boots, so dense it felt like walking through metallic grit. Dave knew exactly what that meant. Extreme gold concentrations upstream. This wasn't a normal deposit. It was a signal, a breadcrumb trail, and it was leading them toward something someone had tried very hard to hide. The tunnel curved, then opened into a narrow choke point where the rock suddenly gave way to a neatly built wall of stones. They weren't debris. They weren't natural fall. They were placed, stacked deliberately, locked together like a dry-built barrier meant to seal something inside. No nails, no mortar, just methodical human hands constructing a door underground. No one said a word as Dave stepped forward and touched the cold stone face. Older than any man alive, yet stable, tight, purposeful. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to block the passage beyond. They began removing the stones one at a time, methodical but fast enough to keep momentum. Each rock scraped against the next, grinding old dust into the air. Then, after the 10th stone came free, the doorway exhaled, a long rush of stale, compressed air spilling into the drift. The temperature shifted immediately. Whatever space lay behind that wall had been sealed for generations. Dave squeezed through first, sweeping his headlamp across the chamber that opened before them. The ceiling was held up by thick, hand-cut timbers, still strong, untouched by moisture or decay. It was like stepping into a sealed time capsule. The floor crunched under their boots, a thick layer of tailings spread across the ground. Not dumped, not abandoned. These were washed tailings, hand-washed, sorted, inspected. Someone had worked this chamber slowly, deliberately, harvesting every grain of gold-rich material they could carry in. In the corner, half buried under the tailings, lay an old sluice box. Dave brushed the sediment off its surface, and his jaw locked in disbelief. It was filled, packed, layered with trapped gold dust and small flat flakes that had been accumulating for who knew how long. But that wasn't what stopped him cold. The dust around the sluice wasn't undisturbed. It had been moved, shifted, pressed down by weight. And then Dave saw it, a boot print. Not old, not weathered, not softened by time. Fresh, edges sharp, tread unmistakable. Someone had been inside this sealed chamber recently. Someone who had no business being this deep inside a blocked drift that wasn't on any map. Dave's light followed the prints across the chamber. They weren't random. The visitor had walked with a purpose, straight toward a tight side passage that barely looked wide enough for a man to squeeze through. This passage wasn't marked on any old notes, not referenced in the leather pouch, not included in the maps. Whoever built it had kept it secret even from the miners who sealed the drift. The prints slid into the narrow entrance, kicking up fine dust that still floated in the air. Dave crouched and stepped inside. The walls changed immediately. The rough-cut rock of the old drift was replaced by a smooth, impossible shimmer. Golden flecks danced across the stone surface, catching the light like stars trapped underground. Fine, natural gold, so pure and light it seemed to float. No one had ever mined this. No one had ever documented it. The amount of trapped gold in these walls alone could rewrite the geology of the whole valley. But the mystery only deepened as Caleb bent to pick up something lying half-buried near the entrance. A glove. Modern. Nylon mesh. Rubber grip. Barely worn. Someone had dropped it not days ago, not weeks ago, recently enough that it hadn't even collected dust. Then Caleb spotted something else wedged between two rocks, a lantern. Metal, old, but with soot still fresh around the rim. The wick was blackened, crisp, burnt within the last month. Someone had used this lantern to explore this hidden cut. Someone whose prints still marked the ground, whose gloves still lay discarded, who had walked deeper into the unknown with full knowledge of a chamber no one on Dave's crew had ever heard of. The narrow passage sloped downward, tightening until Dave had to turn sideways to keep moving. The air thickened, cooler now, carrying the smell of damp earth. The golden shimmer faded, replaced by darker stone. Then the ground dropped away abruptly. Dave raised his light and saw it. A wooden ladder rising from a shaft that plunged straight down into darkness. Not collapsed, not rotten, built with care and preserved by the sealed environment around it. The boot prints ended right at the edge of the shaft. Toes pointed down the ladder as if the unknown visitor had climbed without hesitation. The crew crowded behind Dave, breaths shallow, each man staring at the ladder that vanished into the void below. Whoever came before them had descended into a part of the mountain no living miner had acknowledged, a part untouched by history, invisible on records, disconnected from every known tunnel system, a part hidden long before Dave Turin ever set foot on this claim. And that ladder, standing clean and ready, was the only path deeper. The prince had shown the way. The glove confirmed the timeline. The lantern proved the visitor wasn't ancient history. Someone else was chasing the same horde. Someone who was just one level ahead of them. Carrying that urgency with him, Dave gripped the ladder, feeling the cold timber vibrate faintly under his hands, as if whoever descended last had set something in motion below. One careful step after another pulled him into the dark, the light above shrinking until it became nothing more than a memory. The farther he climbed, the more the tunnel changed, layers of compacted gravel giving way to dense ancient silt, the air warming around him as though he was entering the mountain's lung. When his boots finally hit solid ground, the space opened around him in a way no man-made cut ever could. A vast cavern curved outward in smooth, sweeping arcs, its walls sculpted by water flows that vanished thousands of years before mining ever existed. This wasn't a tunnel someone dug. This was a natural vault the mountain had sealed and protected, accessible only through the same ladder someone else had already trusted. And now, Dave stood inside it, knowing he wasn't alone, just behind, just below, just close enough to feel their trail still warm in the air. His headlamp revealed a floor glittering with a texture he recognized instantly. Pay gravel. Thick, dense, untouched. Not a single shovel mark or blast fracture disturbed the ground. It was virgin earth, rich and heavy, carrying the weight of gold-bearing history that had never seen daylight. The veins running through the walls confirmed it. Thick quartz bands streaked in multiple directions, splitting like lightning bolts, each vein shot through with gold. Some sections shimmered with exposed flecks, others bulged like swollen arteries waiting to burst open. This cavern alone could bankroll an entire mining season. But something else tugged at Dave's attention. The hum. Soft at first, then more distinct once he paused to listen. Airflow, a current moving through the cavern, brushing past his face, carrying the faint scent of old dust and older secrets. Airflow meant an exit, a second path, a way out the miners had relied on when they came down here more than a century ago. He followed the current, pushing through clusters of smooth stones and winding around quartz bulges until a shape on the ground froze him mid-step. A wooden box, shattered and half-buried under collapsed rock. Not a tool chest, not a dynamite crate. A miner's cash box, built to hide something valuable, not to store equipment. Dave crouched and brushed away the centuries of debris until the lid came free in his hands. Inside, glowing under the dust, were raw gold samples, nuggets, wires of crystalline gold, chunks of ore richer than anything the main tunnels had ever produced. These were trophies, proof of what lay deeper, hidden away by miners who never came back to retrieve them. If they hid their samples, it meant they'd found something worth burying. The airflow tugged stronger, pulling Dave toward a narrow gap in the cavern wall. He squeezed through, boots crunching across gravel that quickly shifted into planked flooring. The change was abrupt and unmistakable. Man-made construction. The exit wasn't a natural escape route. It was a tunnel, timbered, reinforced, and built with far more precision than any legitimate mining operation of that era. Dave immediately recognized the style. This wasn't normal mine work. This was smuggler engineering. Thick beams stronger than necessary, cross-braced aggressively, designed to hide heavy movement beneath the earth. Smugglers in the early 1920s used techniques like this to move contraband through mountains and across borders without leaving a trace on the surface. He swept his metal detector along the tunnel walls, expecting occasional hits from old nails or rusted cans. Instead, the device screamed the moment it activated. Spikes, continuous, overwhelming spikes. Something massive and metallic was buried under the tunnel floor. Something long. Something dense. They pushed farther until Caleb uncovered a set of rail lines embedded beneath layers of mud and silt. Only a few inches of rusted track poked through, enough to confirm the design. Narrow-gauge rails used to haul extremely heavy loads, fast and silently, deep underground. No ordinary miners built tracks like these. Only smugglers did. Men who moved stolen ore, illicit gold, and contraband where no lawman could ever find it. Following the half-exposed rails, Dave's crew dug through the mud until their shovels hit something hollow. They scraped and pried until a large shape emerged, a rail cart toppled on its side, buried by time. When they pulled it free, the contents spilled out in a cascade of glittering fragments, high-grade ore, veins thicker than any they'd seen above ground, heavy clumps of gold-rich quartz that would have been worth a fortune even in the 1920s. Whoever used this tunnel wasn't mining on the side. They were stealing gold on an industrial scale. The trail of ore spillage grew heavier the farther they followed the tracks. Nuggets lay scattered like breadcrumbs, wedged into cracks, pressed into old mud, abandoned in the rush of movement. The smugglers had been moving something enormous, pushing deeper into the mountain with every cartload. Then the rails ended abruptly at a massive wall of reinforced timber. A bulkhead door, sealed tight, built thicker than anything Dave had ever seen underground. The wood was cracked with age but still intact, locked into place by steel bolts now fused with rust. Dave studied the door, running his fingers across the worn metal, feeling for weak spots. There, a seam just wide enough for a pry bar. With a grunt and leverage, the bulkhead groaned open, releasing a draft of air so heavy with metallic scent that it tasted like pennies on his tongue. Gold. Raw, pure, concentrated gold. The chamber beyond wasn't just a continuation of the tunnel, it was a vault. A vaulted dome carved by hand, each curve smoothed by labor, shaped deliberately to hold something sacred. His light swept across the floor, and the world seemed to freeze. Neat piles of quartz boulders were stacked in concentric rings around the room. Not random, collected, chosen. Each boulder veined with gold so thick it glowed under the lamp. Layer upon layer of raw wealth, more than any drifting crew could ever pack out discreetly. This wasn't smuggling. This was harvesting. And the smugglers were storing everything in one hidden vault. But the real weight of the discovery sat at the center of the dome. A mound taller than Dave's shoulders, covered completely by an old canvas sheet. The fabric was stiff with age, fraying at the edges, but the shape beneath it was unmistakable, angular, uneven, heavy. And at the base of the canvas, leaking through the folds, tiny streaks of gold dust shimmered under Dave's light. Whatever lay under that covering had been hidden with intent, protected, secreted away from every miner, every inspector, every map maker. The canvas shifted as Dave drew closer, the faint movement almost inviting him to expose what had been sealed here for generations. Driven by that silent beckoning, Dave gripped the edge of the canvas, feeling the brittle fibers crumble under his fingers. One steady pull sent a cloud of dust rolling across the vault, and as the sheet fell away, the sight beneath it froze the entire crew in place. The mound wasn't just ore, it was raw, concentrated treasure. Mammoth nuggets, lumpy and uneven, some the size of bricks, and others even larger, lay piled in a glittering heap. Not the thumb-sized pieces miners boast about, but colossal chunks ripped straight from an untouched system. They pulsed under the lamps, catching every shard of light like living embers awakened after a century in the dark. Dave knelt and lifted one nugget with both hands. It wasn't just heavy, it was impossibly heavy, a solid chunk weighing dozens of pounds. No way could a crew move this amount by hand. The tracks, the carts, the reinforced smuggler tunnel, it all suddenly made sense. They weren't moving equipment or stolen supplies. They were hauling out gold too dense and too bulky to carry out in sacks. And whoever did it had been methodical, loading only the richest material, leaving behind anything that wasn't nearly pure. As the crew scanned the pile, Caleb uncovered several rectangular shapes beneath the nuggets. Bars. Not government-issued, not bank standard. These bars were hand-poured, still rough around the edges, each stamped with a strange personal mark. A single symbol, punched deep into the gold, a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines. No one recognized it. Not a known mining company, not a historical marking. It was a signature, a claim of ownership from a miner who clearly never intended to share the location of this hoard. Dave slipped a bar onto his scale and did the math, his mind working even faster than his pulse. The weight, the purity, the size of the nuggets, the untouched quartz veins surrounding the room. Individually, each piece was worth a fortune. Together, the numbers surpassed anything he'd ever calculated, even conservatively, even assuming some loss, even lowering purity estimates. It still came out to over $105 million in today's market. And that was only what sat above ground. The walls themselves held more. The ancient channel above them held more. This wasn't a deposit. It was an empire buried in one hidden vault. He circled the mound, flashlight sweeping across the floor, and then saw something that raised every hair on his neck, a dark gap behind the hoard. A second tunnel, narrow, jagged, filled with collapsed debris. And the collapse didn't look accidental. The stones were too uniform in size, the seal too compact, as if someone had intentionally filled the shaft until it became impenetrable. The rocks carried dust patterns that suggested they had all dropped within seconds of each other, not over years. Whoever sealed it knew exactly what they were doing. Dave approached the tunnel mouth and studied the rubble, noticing how the edges of the fallen stones were chipped cleanly, not weathered. The beams around the entrance, half buried under the fall, bore faint black scorch marks, burn patterns, residue. Some miner had set dynamite charges here more than a century ago. Not for excavation, for concealment. They wanted this tunnel buried so completely that even if someone found the first vault, they would never reach whatever lay beyond. Historical stories Dave had heard over the years suddenly resurfaced. Rumors of two feuding mining families who operated illegally along old claims. Stories of stolen shipments, missing men, and silent retribution in the dead of night. Nothing concrete, nothing written, but enough to suggest a violent history beneath the mountain's quiet surface. Watching the blast patterns and analyzing the collapse, Dave realized the stash wasn't just hidden to protect wealth, it was buried to end a war. The winners sealed their victory behind layers of rock, never intending to return. Then Dave spotted something half-burned on one of the timbers. Not paint, not chalk, carved, deep scratches, letters gouged by a trembling hand. He leaned close and read the message. For whoever finds this, run. Not a threat, not a warning of danger, more like a plea from someone who witnessed something they couldn't stop. Someone who expected the mountain itself to turn hostile to anyone who dared seek more. Before Dave could process it, a soft rumble passed through the chamber. A sound so subtle it could have been imagined, except dust rained from the ceiling. The tunnel reacted to the shift in airflow coming through the breached bulkhead. The mere presence of fresh oxygen was destabilizing the ancient construction. Another rumble, a crack, a falling stone, then another. The chamber had waited over 100 years for stillness to be broken. Now the mountain was waking up. Dave didn't hesitate. He called out, voice sharp, commanding the crew to pull samples and move. No one argued. They ripped off chunks of high-grade ore, pocketed proof nuggets, grabbed one stamped bar for verification, and prepared to retreat. The bulkhead groaned behind them as they crossed back into the smuggler's tunnel, the sound like a dying beast taking its last breath. The moment the last man cleared the threshold, the entire bulkhead gave way in a thunderous crash. The vault collapsed in seconds, swallowing the mound, the chamber, the quartz piles, everything. 1,000,000 tons of rock sealed the vault forever. They raced back through the smuggler tunnel as stones rained down, sprinting up the ladder, scrambling into the upper drift. Every tunnel groaned, every timber flexed. The collapse chased them upward like a rolling wave. They burst through the stacked stone doorway just as it disintegrated behind them, the sealed chamber imploding into a tomb. They didn't stop moving until they reached open air, lungs burning, ears ringing, hearts racing. When Dave finally examined the samples under clean light, the truth became undeniable. The purity was beyond anything commercially mined in the region. Wire gold, crystal gold, veins so rich they looked unreal. The hoard they'd seen was just the accessible portion. A stash abandoned during chaos, concealed behind dynamite, preserved by accident. And then the realization hit him. The carved warning hadn't been about danger. It hadn't been telling them to flee the vault. It was telling them to flee the mountain before they went any farther. Whoever carved the message wasn't afraid of the hoard. They were afraid of what lay beyond the collapsed second tunnel. The sealed shaft wasn't hiding the treasure. They were hiding the path to even more of it. The real Mother Lode, the one worth fighting a feud over, still lay untouched behind a wall of collapsed stone, waiting in the darkness beyond the rubble.